They said time heals everything, but no one told her that sometimes it only teaches you how to hide the pain better. And maybe that's why, on that quiet Sunday morning in 1872, Violet Reed sat alone at the back of the church, trembling beneath the weight of every whisper, every stare, every unkind memory that refused to die. You know that feeling, don't you? The one where the whole world seems to watch your silence and mistake it for guilt. She had felt it too, when life broke her heart and left her to face the echo of what used to be love. The wooden pew beneath her creaked as she clenched her handkerchief to her lips, the lace damp with tears she didn't want anyone to see. Crimson Creek was a small town with a long memory, and the people gathered that morning had already chosen what they believed. The sermon was over, the air thick with the smell of dust, candle wax, and judgment. They whispered about the woman who had come back after 5 years away, the one who once dared to dream above her place. Some said she'd lived with outlaws, others claimed she'd worked in a house that no decent woman would step into. No one cared to ask for the truth. Outside, the sun burned through the stained glass windows, slicing across her face in colors too bright for her sorrow. She wanted to stand, to leave, but her body refused. The shame had weight, pressing her down like invisible chains. Through the blur of tears, she could see her reflection in the polished wood of the pew ahead, her own face, pale and drawn, framed by the bonnet she'd chosen for modesty, but which now felt like a disguise. Once she had been the girl everyone adored, the daughter of Jacob Reed, the rancher with lands stretching beyond the hills. But that was before she'd loved the wrong man, before her father's betrayal, before the fire of gossip had burned everything she knew into ash. The church doors groaned, and sunlight spilled through like a revelation. For a heartbeat, all noise stopped. A tall figure filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, hat in hand, the kind of presence that made people straighten unconsciously, unsure if they were looking at trouble or salvation. Her breath caught before she could name him. She didn't have to. The sound of his boots against the wooden floorboards was enough to awaken every heartbeat she thought she had buried. He walked down the aisle, slow, deliberate, each step heavy with years of distance. The whispers began again, rising like the hiss of a snake. She lowered her eyes, praying he would pass, praying he wouldn't stop, because she wasn't ready. Not for this, not for him. But the footsteps stopped beside her. The bench creaked as he sat down without asking, and in that simple act, the air in the church changed. "Folks around here still haven't learned when to hold their tongues," the voice said, deep, calm, and achingly familiar. Her hand trembled around the handkerchief. Violet dared to look up. Kieran O'Malley. 5 years hadn't dimmed the memory of him. His face was older, sharpened by wind and sun, his jaw marked by a scar she didn't remember. His eyes, though, those warm, relentless hazel eyes, were the same. They carried the same quiet strength, the same unspoken promise she had once believed could save her from the world. "I didn't know you were still in Crimson Creek," she whispered. "Most days I'm not," he replied, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Range work keeps me moving. Just happened to be passing through." Passing through. But even she could hear the lie hidden between those words. Around them, the murmurs thickened, the weight of curiosity pressing down like dust. The town that once tore them apart now watched the two of them sit side by side again, like a story that refused to end. Violet tried to compose herself, but her heart betrayed her. Every beat was a memory, his laughter by the creek, the way his hands smelled of earth and tobacco, the night she found him holding another girl, the train she boarded in tears, vowing never to return. She thought of Boston, the cold winters, the sleepless nights grading papers under dim lamplight, pretending that teaching other people's children could fill the ache of having none of her own. She had told herself she was happy, that she had built a new life. But sitting there beside him, she realized that happiness built over denial is fragile. It cracks the moment someone says your name the way it was meant to be said. "You shouldn't pay them any mind," Kieran said softly. "Most of them ain't had an original thought in years." Her lips trembled, but this time a tiny smile escaped. "You always did speak too plain for your own good." He turned to her then, his voice gentling. "Kieran," he corrected. "We're past formalities, don't you think?" The name slipped through her like warmth after winter. Kieran. Outside, the church bells began to ring for the next service, their chime echoing across the hills. She rose quickly, her composure held together by the last threads of pride. "I should go," she said, her voice barely steady. "My aunt will be waiting." "I'll walk you," he offered. "Give them something real to whisper about." For a moment she hesitated, but his hand was already extended, strong, calloused, waiting. Something in her heart gave way, and she placed her gloved fingers in his. The touch burned through the years of distance, and the world outside the church suddenly felt brighter. As they stepped into the sunlight, the whispers fell silent behind them, replaced by a hush that felt almost like awe. Crimson Creek stretched before them, dusty streets, horses tied along the rails, curtains shifting in windows where eyes watched history rewrite itself. They walked without speaking, their shadows moving side by side along the road. It felt strange how something as small as walking beside him could steady her heartbeat, how the air around him carried a quiet comfort she'd forgotten she needed. At the corner, where the road split between the town and the hills beyond, he stopped. "You're staying long?" he asked. "For a while," she said. "My aunt's unwell." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then I'll see you around." He hesitated, then added softly, "If you'll let me." Violet opened her mouth, but no words came. The years had filled the space between them with too much silence to bridge in a single sentence. He tipped his hat, his eyes holding hers just long enough to remind her that some things never fade. Then he walked away, each step echoing like a heartbeat fading into the distance. She watched until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight, the sunlight swallowing him whole. Then she exhaled, slowly, shakily, and for the first time since returning to Crimson Creek, she didn't feel completely alone. That night, as she sat by the window of her aunt's house, the moonlight falling across her face, Violet thought of his words. She thought of the way he sat beside her without asking, unafraid of judgment, unafraid of her pain. And she realized something. Sometimes healing doesn't come as peace. It comes as a person brave enough to stay when everyone else walks away. The night air was cool against her skin. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse whinnied, and the sound felt like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was still whispering. She looked out toward the dark hills, the same direction he had gone, and for the first time in years she smiled. Maybe tomorrow, she thought, the story would start again. And if this story has already touched something inside you, some memory, some ache you thought time had forgotten, stay with it. leave a little thought below. A quiet word for Violet, for Kieran, or for the love you once had to walk away from. Let's walk through this story together. One chapter, one heartbeat at a time. And if it brought a little light to your soul tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it forward, so that somewhere out there, someone else might find a reason to believe in love brave enough to begin again. The church door creaked open, its sound slicing through the thick silence that hung heavy in the air. Sunlight spilled in like liquid gold, framing the tall figure that filled the doorway. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light inside. Dust floated in the air between them, soft as memory. And when he finally moved, his steps echoed with that unhurried confidence only men who had known the weight of the open plains carried. Violet didn't lift her head right away. She didn't have to. Somehow, her body knew before her mind did. The air itself seemed to change when he walked in, like the world was holding its breath. The boots drew closer, slow and deliberate, each step heavy with the rhythm of years lost and words never spoken. Then, without asking, he slid into the pew beside her. For a moment, she froze. No one had dared come near her since she'd returned. Not one soul. And yet here he was, sitting so close that she could feel the quiet heat of him, the faint scent of leather and dust and sun. "Folks around here still haven't learned when to hold their tongues," he murmured, voice deep and low, more felt than heard. Her heart stumbled inside her chest. That voice. She'd tried to forget it once. She turned slowly, the light catching the lines time had carved into his face. The boy she'd known was gone. In his place sat a man with eyes the color of amber dusk, the kind that held stories of storms survived. "Mr. O'Malley," she managed, her voice barely a whisper, raw from the tears she hadn't finished swallowing. "I didn't know you were still in Crimson Creek." He looked straight ahead, his hat resting loosely between his hands. "Most days, I'm not. Range work keeps me moving." Then, quieter, "Just happened to be passing through." It was a lie. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. There was something in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his thumb ran over the edge of the hat brim, like a man trying to steady himself after a long ride towards something that scared him more than any gunfight ever could. Around them, whispers swelled like a storm behind closed doors. The cowboy sat beside her. The church seemed smaller suddenly, their presence together too loud, too visible. But he didn't move. He didn't care. "You shouldn't pay them any mind," he said softly. "Most folks in this town haven't had an original thought in 20 years. Despite herself, Violet felt a fragile smile tremble on her lips. For a heartbeat, it was like being 17 again. The summer nights behind the barn, the stolen glances, the promise of something that could have been forever. "You always did speak your mind," she said quietly. "Kieran," he corrected. "Think we're past formalities, considering our history." The words pulled her backward through time into that one terrible afternoon by the creek, the laughter, the sudden ache, the sight of him with another girl, and the way her world had shattered before she could even breathe. She swallowed hard, the memory bitter as old dust. "I should go," she whispered, rising too fast. "My aunt is expecting me." But before she could take a step, he stood too, tall and steady. "Let me walk you," he said, offering his hand. "Give them something real to talk about." Something inside her faltered. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was that small, unkillable piece of her that still believed in kindness. She placed her gloved hand in his, and together they walked toward the light spilling through the open doors. Outside, the May sun was merciless, pouring over the dusty main street where wagons creaked and horses stamped impatiently at their posts. The world beyond the church felt both the same and utterly changed. Every eye followed them, two figures stepping through the gossip into the brilliance of day. "I heard you were back to care for your aunt," he said as they descended the steps. "Yes, she's been ill. I couldn't let her face it alone." He nodded, glancing down the long stretch of road where heat shimmered like glass. "Kind of you to come back. Considering the whispers?" she asked softly. "Considering what this town can do to a good heart." They walked on in silence for a while, the distance between them measured not in inches but in 5 long years of absence. Every step stirred the ghosts of everything unsaid. When they reached the corner where the road split, one path to the town, one toward her aunt's small house, Violet withdrew her hand, trying to mask the tremor. "I can find my way from here," she said. He studied her face for a long moment. The wind caught a strand of her hair, lifting it like a pale ribbon. "I'm heading out to Preston Ranch tomorrow," he said finally. "Might be gone a few weeks. But when I get back—" He paused, as if weighing something deep inside him. "I'd like to call on you. Properly, if you'd allow it." Her heart caught. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because 5 years is a long time to wonder if you made the biggest mistake of your life." His voice was quiet, honest, stripped of all pretense. "And because those people back there, they never knew the real you, Violet Reed. But I did. I still do." Before she could find the words, he tipped his hat and walked away, the sun burning gold along his shoulders. She stood there, watching until he disappeared behind the livery stable, her pulse unsteady and her eyes damp again, not from sorrow this time, but from the ache of something half-remembered, half-reborn. When she reached home, Aunt Martha was rocking on the porch, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl, sharp eyes knowing more than they let on. "Saw you walking with young O'Malley," her aunt said mildly. "Tongues will be wagging about that." "They already were," Violet sighed, settling beside her. "Then let them wag," Aunt Martha replied. "You can't stop people from talking. But you can choose what you do while they do it." Inside, as she brewed tea, Violet's thoughts returned to the man who had sat beside her when no one else dared. The warmth of his presence lingered like sunlight on her skin. She realized how quiet the house felt without him there, and how the echo of his voice, steady, calm, forgiving, seemed to soothe something raw within her. That night, as the crickets sang outside and her aunt dozed in the next room, Violet sat by the window, watching the stars stretch endlessly above Crimson Creek. She thought about the boy who had become a man, about mistakes that still bled through memory, and about how healing sometimes began with something as small as someone choosing to sit beside you when the world turns away. And though she told herself not to hope, she whispered his name once into the darkness, softly, like a prayer carried by the wind. Kieran. The sound of it comforted her more than she cared to admit. Outside, the night breathed peace over the town, and somewhere far off, a horse whinnied under the pale silver moon. The story that had broken her heart was stirring again, quietly, as if the universe itself was daring her to believe that love, real love, never truly dies. It only waits for the courage to return. The following morning arrived soft and gold, the sun brushing gently against the curtains of Aunt Martha's modest house. Violet woke to the sound of wind chimes and the faint creak of the porch rocker. The house smelled of tea and old wood, like memories that refused to fade. For a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the whispers, the stares, the weight of the past that still clung to her name. But then she heard the sound of voices outside, distant, hushed. The kind of tone that said people were talking about something they shouldn't. About someone. Her. She pressed her hand to her chest and exhaled slowly, forcing the ache back down where it belonged. The world outside her window looked calm. The dusty road, the quiet general store, the church steeple gleaming white against a perfect sky. But Violet knew peace in Crimson Creek was only ever skin-deep. Beneath it, old rumors lived like thorns under the soil, ready to pierce again. After breakfast, she walked into town for supplies. The streets were already awake with the rhythm of small-town life. A wagon rolling past the post office, a group of children chasing a stray dog, Mrs. Parker from the bakery sweeping her front step. Violet carried herself tall, chin lifted, though every gaze felt like a touch she hadn't invited. At the general store, Mr. Hollister nodded stiffly, pretending not to stare. "Mornin', Miss Reed," he muttered, weighing out her sugar and flour. Behind her, two women whispered near the fabric counter. "I heard she's back for good this time," one said, lowering her voice. "Imagine the nerve, showing her face after everything that happened." "Maybe she thinks we've forgotten," the other replied, "but we remember." Violet forced herself to keep her movements steady, her breath even. Every word she overheard carved another small wound. And yet, beneath the pain, something else stirred. A strange calm, a quiet strength. She'd spent 5 years away learning to teach young girls not to shrink beneath cruelty. Maybe it was time to teach herself the same lesson. When she returned home, Aunt Martha was resting. The old woman's breathing was shallow but peaceful. Her silver hair spread against the pillow like a halo. Violet adjusted the blanket, then sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. The house hummed with silence, the kind that had weight, the kind that held secrets. In the afternoon, the knock came, firm, polite, and filled with something unsaid. Violet opened the door to find Mrs. Preston, tall, straight-backed, with eyes that measured more than they saw. The rancher's wife didn't smile. She stepped inside, refusing the offer of tea, and perched on the edge of the chair as if afraid of catching something from the air. "I'll be direct, Miss Reed," she began. "My husband's hired Kieran O'Malley to break some new horses. A fine man, steady worker. But I understand he's shown an interest in you." The words dropped like stones into the quiet room. Violet blinked. Mrs. Preston, Let me finish," the woman interrupted, folding her hands neatly. "You've been gone a long time. Things have changed. Kieran deserves peace, not another tangle of the past. People still remember what happened before you left." "What happened," Violet said softly, "was gossip." Mrs. Preston's mouth tightened. "Perhaps. But gossip has long roots in this town. You'd be wise not to stir them." Something in Violet's chest began to burn. "You mean I should keep away from him?" she said quietly. Mrs. Preston rose, smoothing her skirts. "For his sake, yes. The Reed name still carries a shadow, Miss Reed, and he's worked hard to outlive his." When the door closed behind her, Violet stood still for a long time, the air heavy with everything she hadn't said. Finally she turned and went straight to her aunt's room. "Aunt Martha," she said, her voice trembling. "What did she mean? That Kieran suffered because of our family?" Her aunt opened her eyes, cloudy but sharp. "Sit down, child." Violet sat on the edge of the bed, her hands knotted together. "There are things you don't know," Aunt Martha began. "Things your father kept from you. 2 months after you left for Boston, he accused Kieran of stealing horses from our land." The words struck like thunder. "That's not possible," Violet whispered. "My father would never—" "He did," Martha said quietly, "and it nearly cost Kieran his life. Sheriff Taylor was ready to hang him. Would have too if one of the ranch hands hadn't confessed. Said your father paid him to lie, but the man broke down before the gallows. Kieran was freed, but his reputation—" She sighed. "That kind of stain doesn't wash off easily." Violet rose, pacing the room as tears stung her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone?" "Your father forbade it," her aunt said. "He thought he was protecting you. You were already gone, and by the time he passed, it was too late. He carried his shame to the grave." Violet turned toward the window, the afternoon light catching her face. Her father's stern voice echoed in her memory, his warnings about Kieran, his insistence that she go east. It all made sense now. The truth had been hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat at the small kitchen table with a candle burning low, the scent of wax and dust filling the air. Several times she picked up her pen to write to Kieran, to explain, to apologize, but each letter ended the same way, torn to pieces, words scattered like broken glass across the floor. What could she possibly say that would undo years of silence? Days passed in a blur of chores and half-slept nights. The heat of June pressed down on the valley, thick and merciless. Violet went about her duties, caring for her aunt, her body moving through the motions while her mind wandered back to that scar along Kieran's jaw, to the way he'd said her name as if it still meant something. Then one morning she looked up from hanging laundry and saw him. He was riding toward the gate, sunlight flashing off the metal of his stirrups, his hat shadowing his eyes. When he dismounted, the air seemed to shift again, the same way it had in the church. "Miss Reed," he greeted, his tone careful, polite. "Mr. O'Malley," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "Finished at the ranch earlier than planned." He paused, glancing toward the porch where Aunt Martha's curtains fluttered. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the social tomorrow evening." Violet stared at him. The town social, the one event where everyone gathered to eat, dance, and whisper behind polite smiles. "You'd want to be seen with me? After everything my family did to you?" His gaze didn't waver. "What your father did was between him and me. It's done. I never blamed you." "But the town will talk," she said softly. "They always do." His smile was faint, but real. "I've faced worse than wagging tongues." For the first time in weeks, Violet laughed. A small, quiet sound, but real. It felt strange on her lips, like a bird relearning flight. "All right," she said finally, her pulse trembling beneath her ribs. "If you're not afraid of their talk, neither am I." When he left, she stood at the gate long after his horse had vanished from sight. The wind lifted her hair, cool and tender against her neck, carrying with it something lighter than hope, something like forgiveness. That evening she told her aunt, who only smiled knowingly. "Sometimes," Aunt Martha murmured, "the Lord gives us the same lesson twice just to see if we've learned it right." Violet pressed her hand against her heart, feeling it flutter alive again. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had softened, like a bruise turning to light. Somewhere deep inside, she understood that healing didn't come all at once. It came in quiet moments like this, in a decision to stop running from what once broke you. And as she lay in bed that night, listening to the soft hum of crickets, she realized something beautiful. Maybe love wasn't about forgetting the past, but learning to live gently beside it. Outside, the moon rose over Crimson Creek, silver and whole, casting its tender light across the sleeping town. And in that light, Violet found a fragile peace she hadn't felt in years, a calm before whatever storm tomorrow might bring, and a small, trembling hope that this time she wouldn't face it alone. The evening air felt alive with the scent of lilacs and dust, soft as a secret waiting to be spoken. Violet stood before the small mirror in her aunt's room, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the ribbon at her waist. The pale blue dress she'd brought from Boston shimmered faintly in the lamplight, modest but touched with a quiet grace. It had been years since she'd dressed for anyone, and she wasn't sure who she was doing it for now. Maybe for herself. Maybe for the memory of the girl who used to believe in simple, beautiful things before the world taught her otherwise. Aunt Martha's voice drifted in from the porch. "He's here, child. Try not to keep him waiting." "You'll only make him more nervous than he already is." Violet smiled faintly. "He's not the nervous kind. Even the strongest hearts tremble when it's something that matters," the old woman said with a knowing look. When Violet stepped outside, the last colors of sunset stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold. Kieran stood by the gate, the reins of a borrowed wagon in his hand, dressed in a clean black suit and white shirt. The sight of him made the world go strangely still. His dark hair had been trimmed, his jaw newly shaven, and though he carried the roughness of a man who lived by his hands, there was something tender in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart stumble. "You look beautiful," he said softly. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. "Thank you." He offered his hand to help her up, and when their fingers met, she felt that old warmth bloom again, the one she'd tried to bury, the one that had never really left. The ride into town was quiet. The rhythm of the horses' hooves filled the space between them, steady as a heartbeat. Violet watched the fields roll by under the fading light, the tall grass bending gently in the wind, the mountains resting in the distance like sleeping giants. For a moment, she could almost believe the years between them had been only a dream. When they reached the town hall, the sounds of laughter and music spilled out through open windows. The scent of fresh bread and pine oil drifted through the air. Yet the moment they stepped inside, the noise softened to a hush. Conversations faltered. Every eye turned toward them. The disgraced woman and the cowboy who had chosen to stand beside her again. Violet's fingers tightened on Kieran's arm. "Ignore them," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Let them see what grace looks like when it walks through fire. She smiled faintly at that, though her heart raced. Together they walked across the room, the sound of their steps echoing softly over the wooden floor. The band struck up a waltz, and Kieran turned to her with a slight bow. "May I?" Violet hesitated only a breath before placing her hand in his. His touch was gentle, sure. As he led her into the dance, the whispers faded, the world shrinking until it was only the two of them, his hand at her back, her pulse steadying to the rhythm of his. He moved with a grace that surprised her, his body guiding hers effortlessly through each turn. She remembered the boy who had once tripped over his own boots behind the barn and felt a soft laugh rise in her throat. When she met his eyes, he was already smiling, as though he'd heard her thought. For the first time since she'd returned to Crimson Creek, Violet felt something loosen inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was close. Between songs, they stepped aside for a glass of punch. The heat in the room had grown thick, and she fanned herself lightly. Kieran watched her with quiet amusement. "Why did you never marry Sarah Williams?" she asked before she could stop herself. His expression darkened slightly. "There was never an engagement, despite what folks said. But I saw the announcement." "Your father's doing," he said quietly. "He wanted my land. Thought if he tied me to her, I'd sell it to merge our properties. When I refused, he announced the engagement anyway." Violet's breath caught. "I thought I saw you with her, by the creek, just before I left." He looked down, shaking his head. She was crying. Her mother had passed, and she lost the locket that belonged to her. I was helping her search for it. That was all. I tried to tell you, but you were gone before I could." The memory pressed against her heart, heavy and aching. She had built 5 years of bitterness on a misunderstanding. "I wanted to hate you," she admitted softly. "It was easier than wondering." "I know," he said simply, "and I wanted to stop missing you, but I never could." Before she could answer, a shadow fell across them. Sarah Williams stood a few feet away, her lips pressed into a thin line. The music went on, but the air shifted, charged and uneasy. "So, this is what you've come back for," Sarah said quietly. "To parade yourself in front of everyone." Violet straightened her shoulders. "I came to live my life, nothing more." "Your life?" Sarah's laugh was sharp. "You ruin his reputation, disappear for years, and now you think you can just waltz back into town?" Kieran stepped between them, his voice calm but edged with warning. "That's enough, Sarah." The crowd around them pretended not to watch, but leaned closer all the same. The tension rippled through the hall like a storm about to break. "You promised me," Sarah spat, her voice rising. "You said when she was gone—" "I never promised you anything," Kieran said firmly. "And I won't stand here while you twist the truth." Before another word could fall, Sheriff Taylor stepped forward from the doorway, his hand resting on his belt. "Maybe it's time we settle this once and for all," he said, his tone heavy. "The truth's been buried long enough." The music stopped. Silence stretched wide across the room. The sheriff's gaze found Mrs. Williams in the crowd, her face pale and rigid. "I have a signed confession from your ranch hand, Peterson. He admitted you and your husband helped frame Jacob Reed for stealing horses from the O'Malley property. You wanted the land Kieran refused to sell." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Williams stumbled backward, her lips trembling. "That's a lie." "No," the sheriff said evenly. "It's justice, and it's long overdue." Violet's world tilted. Her father's sins, the shame, the guilt she had carried, they were all tangled in the lies of others. She felt the weight begin to lift, replaced by something new and unfamiliar. Relief. Kieran's hand found hers, steady and warm. "You see?" he whispered. "The truth always finds its way home." When the crowd dispersed and the gossip turned toward a new scandal, Kieran led her outside into the cool night. The stars burned high above them, sharp and clear against the velvet dark. "I'm sorry you had to hear it like that," he said softly. Violet looked up at him, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I'm not. The truth needed its moment." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the creek that wound its way behind the town, the sound of it soft and eternal. "All those years," she murmured, "I thought my father was cruel." "He was trying to protect you in the only way he knew how," Kieran said. "Doesn't make it right, but maybe it makes it human." The words settled between them like a benediction. The night felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the wind itself had swept through and carried the dust of the past away. He turned to her, his eyes gentler than she remembered. "Come on," he said. "Let's walk." They moved together through the quiet streets, side by side. No one whispered now. The moonlight bathed them both in silver, and for the first time since she'd come home, Violet felt unafraid of being seen. By the time they reached the edge of town, the world had grown still. The creek shimmered in the distance, a ribbon of light weaving through the dark. Kieran stopped there, looking out at it. "This is where I last saw you," he said quietly. 5 years ago." "I remember," Violet whispered. "I thought it was the end." "Maybe it was just the beginning," he said, his voice almost a prayer. The night held its breath around them, soft and infinite. Violet felt something inside her shift, something she hadn't known was still capable of hope. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You deserved better than what this town gave you." She smiled faintly. "So did you." Their eyes met, and for a long suspended moment there was no past, no gossip, no pain. Only two souls who had found their way back to the same point after wandering through their own wilderness. In the distance, a church bell rang midnight, slow and steady. The sound carried across the valley, weaving through the silence like a promise. Violet closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. For the first time, the whispers that had once haunted her seemed far away, softened by forgiveness and the quiet healing that had begun to take root. And when she opened her eyes again, Kieran was still there beside her, steady as the stars, patient as grace. The wind lifted around them, carrying the scent of wild sage and river water, and in that gentle night the story that had broken her heart began to find its way toward mending. The moonlight stretched across the fields, silvering the edges of the world like something holy. The night was soft, but Violet's heart trembled as if it remembered every wound it had ever carried. They stopped by the edge of Crimson Creek, the place where everything had once ended, and now perhaps where it might begin again. The water murmured gently over stones, carrying the scent of wet earth and wild mint. Somewhere far off, a night-bird called, and the sound felt like a prayer whispered for broken things finding their way home. "This is where I last saw you," Kieran said, his voice quiet but sure. the same voice that once steadied her when she was young and afraid. She looked toward the shimmering creek. 5 years ago. I thought you and Sarah... He shook his head before she could finish. There was never anyone else, Violet. There never could be. The words fell into her like light through cracked glass, soft but unstoppable. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The weight of everything she had believed, everything she had misunderstood, came tumbling down inside her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why didn't you send word?" "I did," he said. "Dozens of letters. Your father sent them back, unopened. I reckon he thought he was doing what was best, protecting you from a man he didn't think was worthy." Her eyes filled with tears that caught the moonlight. "He thought he was keeping me safe," she murmured, "and all he did was make sure we both suffered." He stepped closer, and his hand found hers, rough and warm, grounding her in the now. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe we needed to walk through the wilderness first, to find our way back to where it all started." For a while, neither spoke. The creek whispered around them, patient and eternal. She thought of all the years they had lost, years filled with other people's lies, other people's fears. And yet, standing here, she realized those years had not taken love from her. They had only hidden it, waiting for the courage to uncover it again. "I was angry for so long," she said, her voice trembling. "Angry at you, at myself, at everyone who ever whispered my name like it was a curse. I thought leaving would save me, but I just carried the hurt somewhere new." He brushed his thumb over her knuckles. "You don't owe this town a thing, Violet. You came back anyway. That takes more courage than all their gossip put together." A faint smile touched her lips, small but real. "You always had a way of making the impossible sound simple." He laughed softly. "Only when it comes to you." The sound of his laughter, it was the same and yet changed, deeper now, weighted with years and miles. It loosened something in her chest, and for the first time since she had returned to Crimson Creek, she let herself breathe without pain. They stood together in silence, watching the moon's reflection tremble on the water. It seemed to Violet that forgiveness lived here, in the quiet spaces between their words. "Do you ever wonder," she asked after a while, "what life might have been if none of it had happened?" He nodded slowly. "Sometimes. But then, I reckon we wouldn't be who we are now. We had to break a little to learn what love costs, and what it's worth." His honesty ached in her like a balm. She looked up at him, her eyes soft, the wind lifting the loose strands of her hair. "And what is it worth to you?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "Everything." The word hung there between them, vast and unshakable. When he leaned down and kissed her, it wasn't the wild rush of youth, but something slower, gentler, born from pain and patience and a deep knowing that love, when true, waits as long as it must. The world around them seemed to still, the air, the creek, the very stars, as if the night itself bowed its head to witness the mending of what had been broken. When they finally drew apart, her eyes shone with tears that didn't hurt. "I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like," she whispered. He smiled softly. "You never forget something that was written on your soul." The next morning the town was different. Maybe it was only Violet who had changed, but the air felt lighter somehow. People looked at her with less judgment, more curiosity. The story had turned. and now the whispers were about the truth, finally laid bare. The Williams family's lies, the sheriff's confession, the way the cowboy had stood by her side when no one else dared. Healing, Violet realized, didn't come with fanfare. It came quietly, like dawn, soft and slow, until suddenly the whole world was bathed in light. Over the following weeks, she found herself moving through her days with a steadier heart. She took over the teaching position at the little schoolhouse, the one she had dreamed of as a girl. The children loved her stories of Boston, of faraway places and lessons learned from kindness. Each time she stood before them, she thought of how easily innocence could be broken, and how sacred it was to help it grow whole again. Kieran visited often. Sometimes he'd ride up to her porch in the evening, dusted in sunlight, carrying wildflowers wrapped in twine or a basket of apples from a rancher's orchard. They'd sit together as the sky blazed orange, talking about small things, the weather, the crops, her aunt's health. But beneath it all, their silence spoke louder. It said we made it through. One evening, Aunt Martha sat rocking in her chair, watching them from the porch with a knowing smile. "Your mother would have liked him," she said. "He's got that look in his eyes, the kind of man who knows how to stay." Violet turned toward Kieran, her heart swelling with something too tender to name. By late summer, the fields around Crimson Creek glowed golden under the setting sun. The gossip that once poisoned her name had turned into admiration. Folks greeted her kindly now. They bought her aunt's preserves at the market, asked about her school, about Kieran. The same mouths that once whispered cruel things now spoke of her strength. Funny, she thought, how easily judgment turns to praise when time has softened its edges. On an afternoon heavy with the scent of hay and honeysuckle, Kieran arrived with a nervous smile and an envelope in his hand. Inside was a letter, a formal one from the county board, offering Violet the permanent position of schoolmistress. She looked up, eyes bright. "You knew about this?" He grinned, leaning against the porch railing. "Might have put in a word or two." She laughed, a sound that filled the air like music. "You shouldn't have." "Couldn't help it," he said. "Crimson Creek needs someone who teaches more than letters and sums. Someone who teaches hearts to heal." Her throat tightened, and before she could answer, he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small velvet box. "I was going to wait," he said softly, "but I reckon life's too short for waiting." Inside was a simple ring, a band of gold, no gem, no flourish, only a circle as steady as his gaze. "I've loved you since we were 18, he said, his voice breaking a little. "I aim to love you till my last breath. Will you let me?" The tears came then, hot and free, not of sadness, but of grace. She nodded, unable to speak. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been waiting there all along. When he kissed her again, Aunt Martha laughed softly behind them. "About time," she said. "The whole town's been holding its breath." Their wedding was small and filled with light. It took place in the same church where Violet had once cried alone, the same pews that had echoed with whispers now filled with smiles and song. Even old Mr. Hollister came, bringing a silver serving set as a gift, muttering something about second chances. As they walked out into the golden afternoon, bells ringing above them, Kieran turned to her and whispered, "Welcome home, Mrs. O'Malley." The sound of it made her heart bloom. That night, as they stood on the porch of their new house overlooking the valley, the stars spread endless above them. Violet leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "You were right," she said softly. "It wasn't the end back then." "No," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "It was just where the healing began." And under that wide Colorado sky they stood together, two souls who had been broken and remade, bound not by perfection, but by forgiveness and faith. The kind of love that doesn't ask to be believed, only lived. The morning after their wedding broke tenderly over Crimson Creek, the light spilling across the valley like melted honey. The world looked softer, as if touched by a quiet mercy. The air smelled of sage and sunlight and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that grew near the fence line. Violet woke in the little house Kieran had built with his own hands, a place of wood and patience and love. The morning light traced its way through the window, landing across his sleeping form beside her. For a long while she simply watched him breathe, the slow rhythm steady and safe, his arm draped over her waist like it belonged there. Outside, a meadowlark sang. The sound threaded through the stillness, a gentle reminder that life, in all its brokenness, always finds a way to begin again. Violet pressed her hand to her heart and thought of how far they had come, from tears in the back of a church to this quiet morning filled with grace. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her. It had transformed into something else, a lesson carved by time, teaching her that love, when true, does not shatter under weight. It bends, it bruises, but it endures. When Kieran stirred, he opened his eyes with that slow, sleepy smile she had already come to love again. "You're real," he murmured, his voice rough with mourning. She smiled softly. "So are you." He reached up and brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "You look like peace," he said, and she felt it, deep in her bones. The kind of peace that doesn't come from the world's approval, but from finally being where you belong. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. Violet took up her work at the schoolhouse, her voice steady and kind as she taught the children their letters and stories. And she filled the room with sunlight and laughter, believing that every lesson, even the smallest, could plant a seed of gentleness in a world that often forgot how to be kind. Kieran spent his days on the range, training horses with that same calm strength that had once steadied her trembling heart. He rode with the patience of a man who understood that wild things must be met with trust, not force. In the evenings, when the sun melted into gold behind the ridge, he would ride home, dust clinging to his boots, the smell of hay and wind following him through the door. Violet would be waiting, apron tied at her waist, a pot of stew simmering, her eyes soft with the quiet joy of knowing someone always came home to her. They would sit on the porch after supper, sharing stories while the sky turned to fire, then indigo, then deep velvet. Some nights he played his harmonica while she hummed softly beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about Boston?" he asked one evening as the stars began to bloom above them. "Sometimes," she said, "but it feels far away now, like a chapter that belonged to another life." "Do you miss it?" She smiled faintly. "No. I think I went there to learn what home really means. And now that I've found it, I don't look back." He nodded, his fingers brushing over hers. "I'm glad you came back." "So am I," she whispered. Their home became a small sanctuary, the kind that carried the sound of laughter and prayers in its walls. Aunt Martha, whose health had improved with the calm of peace, often visited, sitting by the hearth and crocheting while Violet read aloud. She would shake her head and say, "Your mother would have been proud, child. You turned your sorrow into something good." And Violet would smile, because she finally believed that too. By spring, the valley bloomed again. The horses grew strong under Kieran's care, and word spread that his stock was the finest in the territory. Folks came from towns miles away to buy or trade, and even those who had once whispered now tipped their hats when they saw him ride by with his wife beside him. The church, that had once been a place of humiliation, became a place of belonging. On Sundays, they sat in the front pew together, their hands joined as the light from the stained glass spilled over them like a blessing. Sometimes Violet caught herself remembering that first day back, the cruel whispers, the shame that had burned her cheeks, and she would look over at Kieran and know how far grace had carried them. Healing, she had learned, wasn't loud. It came like rain on dry soil, soft, slow, patient. One evening, as summer approached, they walked down to the creek where it had all begun. The air was thick with the hum of crickets, and the water shimmered under the setting sun. Kieran skipped a stone across the surface. It danced 3 times before sinking. "You know," he said, smiling, "I used to come here after you left, sat on that same bank, wondering where you were, what you were doing, whether you were happy." She turned toward him. "And were you?" He looked down, his smile fading into something tender. "No. I was alive, but I wasn't living. You were the peace I didn't know how to be without." Her breath caught. The truth of it washed through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You waited," she said quietly. "I never stopped," he answered simply. The silence between them was full, alive with memory and promise. Then Violet reached for his hand and whispered, "Thank you for coming back to me." "I never left," he said. "Not really." That night they lay under the stars by the water, the earth warm beneath them, the sky vast and endless. She traced the constellations with her finger, naming the ones she remembered from childhood. He listened, his arm beneath her head, his thumb drawing slow circles against her shoulder. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that maybe everything, every heartbreak, every wrong turn, was leading us here?" He smiled against her hair. "Maybe God knew we needed to lose each other to learn how to love each other right." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were the good kind, the kind that heal as they fall. "I used to pray," she whispered. "When I was alone in Boston, I didn't ask for much, just peace. I never thought he'd give me you again." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Sometimes peace looks like a person," he murmured. The sound of the creek lulled them into quiet. The moon rose high, silvering everything it touched. Violet closed her eyes and felt the world breathe with her. When autumn came, their lives settled into the gentle rhythm of work and love. Kieran's horses won prizes at the county fair, and Violet's students sent her home with wildflowers tied with ribbons. They planted a small orchard behind their house, built a swing from an old oak branch, and filled their evenings with music and laughter. On the first anniversary of their wedding, she stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Her belly was round beneath her dress, the promise of new life glowing within her. Kieran came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands resting gently over their child. "Funny how life turns," he whispered. "A year ago, you were crying in the back of that church. And a handsome cowboy sat beside me," she said with a smile. "Changed everything." He laughed softly. "No, sweetheart. We changed it together." She leaned back against him, feeling his breath against her neck, and the world felt whole again. Their daughter was born on a snowy morning, the kind where the world holds its breath in awe. They named her Catherine Martha O'Malley, after both women who had given them the strength to keep going. When Violet held her for the first time, she wept quietly, her tears falling onto the baby's soft, dark hair. Kieran sat beside her, awe written in every line of his face. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's ours," Violet replied, her voice thick with wonder. As the years passed, the house filled with laughter, the kind that carries through open windows on warm evenings. The townspeople, once sharp with judgment, spoke kindly now when they saw her walking to church with her child in her arms. Even Mrs. Preston, softened by time, sent over a blanket she'd knitted herself. Life, Violet realized, has a way of mending what we think is beyond repair. It doesn't erase the scars, it teaches us to wear them like proof that we survived. On their 5th anniversary, Kieran built her a garden behind the house, a place full of lavender, roses, and white lilies. She spent her mornings there, her daughter playing among the flowers while she hummed softly, sunlight catching in her hair. Each petal felt like a prayer answered in its own quiet way. That night, as the stars shimmered above them, Kieran took her hand and whispered, "This place feels like heaven." "It's home," she said, smiling, "and home is where healing lives." He pulled her close, and the sound of the night wrapped around them, crickets, wind, the faint laughter of a child in the distance. They had walked through fire and found grace waiting on the other side. And now, standing beneath that endless sky, Violet understood what love truly was. Not perfection, not the absence of pain, but the choice to keep believing in light, even when the world goes dark. Years passed like rivers flowing through golden meadows, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong, but always forward. Crimson Creek changed with the seasons, but the little house at its edge remained a quiet refuge of love and laughter. The whispers that once followed Violet had long faded into stories told around fires, softened by time, reshaped by memory, and remembered not as scandal, but as proof that grace had bloomed where shame once stood. By the time their daughter Catherine could run barefoot through the fields, the valley had become alive with promise. The railroad had reached the edge of town, and strangers came and went, bringing new faces, new dreams, and a new rhythm that breathed life into the once-forgotten corner of Colorado. But even as the world beyond expanded, Violet and Kieran remained anchored in something unchanging. The steady heartbeat of home, the sacred ordinary of each day. Every morning, Violet woke to the sound of roosters calling across the ridge, and Kieran chopping wood out back. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the soft laughter of a child trying to feed crumbs to the family dog. Life was simple, but it was full. The kind of full that didn't demand attention. It simply was. Sometimes, when she stood by the window with sunlight pouring over her shoulders, Violet thought of the girl she had been, the one who had cried in the back of the church, broken and alone. It almost felt like remembering someone else's life. She had forgiven that girl for not knowing how strong she was, forgiven her father too, for loving in the only way he knew how, flawed but real, and perhaps, most of all, she had forgiven the town, for being human, for stumbling toward its own kind of healing. In time, the small schoolhouse where she taught grew, its single room replaced by a larger building funded by the new settlers. Violet was named headmistress, a title that once would have filled her with pride, but now only reminded her of responsibility. To teach, she had come to realize, was not just to fill minds, it was to tend hearts, to teach kindness, to show her students that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength. Kieran's horse ranch flourished too. His name became known across counties, and yet he never let the attention pull him away from what mattered. He often said success meant nothing if it couldn't be shared at the supper table. Every evening, no matter how busy, he came home before dark, his silhouette familiar against the horizon, a sight that always made Violet's heart still. Their love had changed shape through the years. It was no longer the wildfire of youth, but something gentler, deeper, like the quiet after rain. There were days of laughter and days of silence, arguments followed by apologies whispered in the dark, moments of exhaustion softened by touch. Real love, Violet had learned, wasn't a constant flame. It was the decision to keep tending it again and again, even when the wind tried to snuff it out. One summer evening, when the air was thick with the scent of hay and honeysuckle, they sat on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the mountains. Catherine, now 6, was inside humming a song to her doll. Kieran reached over and took Violet's hand, his thumb brushing gently over her wedding ring. "Do you remember?" he said, his voice low and full of warmth. "That day at the church, when everyone was whispering?" She laughed softly. "How could I forget?" "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of them, of you. Scared you'd never forgive me. Scared I'd sit down beside you and you'd walk away." She looked at him, her eyes tender. "You were brave. You sat anyway." He smiled, eyes glinting like the sunset's reflection on water. "Best decision I ever made." She squeezed his hand. "And the bravest." For a while they said nothing more, and the quiet between them was full, heavy with peace. Violet rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of their life, the chirping of crickets, the wind rustling the wheat, their daughter's soft singing drifting through the open window. Time became something they no longer counted. It passed gently, measured not by clocks but by seasons, the first frost on the fence post, the first blossom of spring, the smell of rain on the dirt road. Each year deepened the lines around Kieran's eyes, added silver to Violet's hair, but their hearts seemed to grow younger, as if love had reversed the cruel arithmetic of time. Then, one winter morning, as snow lay heavy across the valley, they stood in the church once more. The same building that had once echoed with gossip now gleamed with candlelight and laughter. But this time, they weren't the ones being whispered about. Catherine stood at the front, her small hands folded, her hair tied with a blue ribbon. She was reciting a poem she had written herself, her voice clear and certain. "Love," she said softly, "is not the fire that burns everything it touches. It's the light that helps you see in the dark." When the congregation applauded, Violet felt tears sting her eyes. She looked toward Kieran, who was already watching her with that same quiet smile that had followed her across all the years. "She's got your heart," he whispered. "And your steadiness," she replied. After the service, Reverend Collins, now older and gentler, approached them. "Strange," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "how time redeems even the hardest stories." Violet nodded. "I think that's what grace is," she said softly. The long road back home. Later, when the sun dipped low, they walked hand in hand down the same path that had once led her to shame and now led her to peace. The wind swept softly through the tall grass, and she thought of how every pain she had carried had somehow brought her here, to this moment, this love, this family. Years kept unfolding. Catherine grew into a young woman with her mother's kindness and her father's courage. 2 more children followed, twin boys with Kieran's eyes and Violet's smile. The house grew louder with laughter and muddy boots, with songs and the clatter of dishes and bedtime prayers whispered through half-closed doors. Aunt Martha lived long enough to see it all, her eyes bright with pride before she passed one spring morning, her hands folded over the quilt she'd made. Violet mourned her deeply, but the loss felt different this time. Less like something being taken, more like something being returned to heaven. When the railroad finally reached the town centre, bringing electricity and new faces, people began calling Crimson Creek the shining heart of the valley. It became a place known not for its gossip, but for its warmth, for the stories told by the firelight in the evenings, for the kindness that passed between neighbours, for the way people said the O'Malleys had changed everything just by staying. Sometimes travellers asked about the legend, the story of the woman who cried in the back of the church while the town whispered, and the cowboy who chose to sit beside her. The locals would smile and tell it softly, their voices full of something reverent. Some called it a love story, others a tale of redemption. But everyone agreed it was proof that goodness could outlast cruelty, and that love, when it's real, could rebuild even what the world tried to tear down. On their 20th anniversary, Kieran took Violet back to the creek. Their children ran ahead, laughing, their shouts echoing through the open air. The water shimmered gold in the evening light, the same as it had all those years ago. "Remember?" he said, his voice soft. "You were crying, and I sat down beside you." She smiled, tears brightening her eyes. "You didn't have to." He looked at her with the same steadiness that had once silenced every cruel word spoken against her. "Yes, I did. I think some part of me always knew that if I walked away, I'd never find peace again." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "And now?" "Now," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair, "I know peace wears your face." The sun sank lower, painting the creek in fire and honey. Their children chased one another across the banks, their laughter rising like a hymn. Violet closed her eyes, the warmth of Kieran's arms wrapping around her as the cool wind brushed her skin. For a moment she felt the years collapse, the pain, the joy, the long road between who she had been and who she had become. Life had been cruel, yes, but it had also been kind. And standing there, surrounded by everything she had once prayed for, Violet finally understood that love wasn't the absence of sorrow. It was the courage to stay open in spite of it. As twilight descended over Crimson Creek, she whispered a silent prayer of thanks. For forgiveness, for time, for a love that had survived the storms. The whispers were long gone, replaced by laughter and birdsong and the gentle hum of life moving forward. But if anyone listened closely enough, they might still hear the echo of that day long ago, the sound of a woman's quiet sobs and the soft creak of a pew as a man sat down beside her, choosing love over pride, grace over judgment. And from that small act of courage, a lifetime bloomed. The years folded into decades like pages of a well-loved book, edges worn from being opened too often, too tenderly. Crimson Creek had grown into a quiet, thriving town, its dusty streets now lined with trees that bloomed each spring with soft white blossoms. The air carried the scent of life renewed. Children ran through those streets the way Catherine once had, their laughter rising into the same blue sky that had once watched over Violet and Kieran when they were young and trembling and full of unspoken hope. Their love had become part of the town's rhythm, stitched into the stories people told when the evenings grew long and the fires burned low. Everyone knew the tale, how a woman, once scorned, returned in silence, how a man, unafraid, sat beside her in a pew full of whispers and changed everything that followed. Some called it legend, some swore it was divine providence, but to those who had lived long enough to remember, it was simply truth. Love had taken root here, and from it grew kindness. The house Kieran built still stood on the hill above the creek, though time had weathered its wood to silver. The porch swing creaked softly, the same familiar rhythm that had once rocked babies to sleep and held countless evening conversations under the stars. Violet now had silver threads in her hair, and Kieran's once strong hands bore the marks of labor and years, but his eyes still carried that steady light, the one that had seen her through every storm. They had raised 4 children, and now grandchildren filled the rooms with music and mischief. The scent of pie cooling on the windowsill, the laughter echoing through the open door, the hum of the river nearby, it was all part of their story, a story that no longer belonged just to them, but to everyone who had ever needed to believe that love could outlast time. On quiet mornings, Violet liked to walk down to the creek. She moved slower now, but her steps were sure. The path, once wild, had been worn smooth by years of memories. First steps, first kisses, endless evenings of waiting for Kieran to return from the range. The creek still sang its same soft song, a lullaby of water and wind. When she reached the old oak by the bank, she would sit and listen to the rustle of the leaves, the music of what was and what remained. Sometimes Kieran would join her, his gait slower now, his hair as white as the morning mist. He would take her hand, still calloused, still warm, and they'd sit in silence. They didn't need words anymore. "You remember," he'd say sometimes, his voice low and full of memory, "how afraid we both were that day in the church?" She would smile. "And you sat beside me anyway." "I'd do it again," he'd say, and she'd whisper, "I know." Time had softened everything, anger, fear, even grief. Their hearts had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering without breaking. Each wrinkle on Violet's face was a story of love kept, of forgiveness chosen, of faith that never stopped growing. When the new church bells rang each Sunday morning, she could still hear the echo of the old ones, the same melody that had once carried her tears, now carrying joy instead. Sometimes, after the sermon, people would approach her quietly to say, "Your story changed something in me." She never quite knew what to say to that, so she would smile and touch their hands and answer gently, "It wasn't the story that changed you. It was the love inside it." Crimson Creek, once a place of whispers, had become a place of peace. The gossiping tongues that once tore her name apart were long gone, replaced by voices that spoke softly of grace, of endurance, of a woman who came home and found not what she had lost, but what she had become. The legend of Violet and Kieran wasn't written in books. It was written in the way the townsfolk treated each other, in the small acts of kindness passed from one heart to another. Their children carried the same light. Catherine became a teacher, just like her mother, filling classrooms with warmth and curiosity. The twins took over the ranch, running it with honor and care, saying they learned more about strength from watching their father love their mother than from any work on horseback. Even their youngest son, who moved east to study, came home often, saying that no city could ever quiet the sound of the creek in his soul. On their 50th anniversary, the town gathered in the church once more, the same building, though rebuilt and brighter now. Candles glowed in every window, and the pews overflowed with faces old and new. Reverend Collins's successor, a young pastor with kind eyes, led the blessing. He spoke of love that defies pride, of forgiveness that becomes freedom, of two people who had taught an entire town what it meant to live by the heart. When Violet and Kieran stood together before the altar, the congregation rose to its feet in silent reverence. Violet's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the place where it had all begun. The same light streaming through the same windows, the same air that had once held the sting of judgment, now filled with laughter and song. Kieran took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar circle of her ring, and whispered, "You're still my miracle." She leaned close, her voice trembling but strong. "And you're still my home." The church bells rang out across the valley once more, carrying their sound all the way to the water that had witnessed everything. That night, when the guests had gone and the candles burned low, Violet and Kieran walked down to the creek for the last time together. The stars hung heavy above them, and the world was quiet, except for the soft murmur of the current. They sat on the same bank where they had first forgiven each other, hands entwined, their reflections trembling in the silver water. "I used to wonder," Violet said softly, "if love could really last a lifetime." He smiled. "And now you know. It lasts beyond it," she whispered. The wind brushed through the grass, carrying the scent of lavender and thyme. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against his shoulder. And in that moment, with the world hushed around them, she felt only gratitude, the deep, healing kind that wraps around the soul and makes every sorrow worth enduring. When morning came, the sun rose over Crimson Creek like it always had, turning the water to gold. Their children found them still sitting there, hands joined, faces peaceful, as if the dawn itself had carried them gently home. The story of Violet and Kieran became something more than memory. It became the heart of Crimson Creek, the story parents told their children, the one couples whispered to each other when life grew hard. The woman who cried at the back of the church and the cowboy who sat beside her lived on not in statues or books, but in the simple, beautiful acts of love that echoed through generations. And sometimes, when the wind moved just right, people swore they could still see them, two figures walking hand in hand by the creek, their laughter soft as the water's song, their love as eternal as the morning light. So, if you've listened to their story today and felt something stir quietly inside you, something tender, something forgiving, then maybe this story found you for a reason. Maybe there's a part of your heart that still believes in love, brave enough to sit beside the broken, in kindness, strong enough to outlast judgment. If this story brought warmth to your spirit or peace to your evening, I invite you to stay a while, leave your thoughts, share what it awakened in you. Let this space be a little light in someone else's night. And if your heart found healing here, if this tale reminded you that love, true love, always finds its way home, then take a moment to like, to subscribe, to share it forward, not as an act of habit, but as a quiet thank you to the universe for reminding us all that kindness still matters. May your days be gentle, your nights full of peace, and may you always find someone brave enough to sit beside you when the world whispers.